Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Katie Balaker. I am a Senior Policy Associate here at HEAL, and I focus on our air quality campaign and also our clean energy campaign. So really excited to be talking tonight about transportation and our unique air quality challenges here in Utah. With me, I have, I'm sure, a couple of HEAL staff. My display with presenting is a little weird, but I know for sure we have our two interns joining us tonight. Abby and Bridget are here. They'll be helping monitor the chat this evening. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started with the presentation. There will be a portion at the end for Q&A. I hope to leave at least about 30 minutes for us to go through questions. So I ask that you please hold any questions till the end. But that said, feel free to just toss them in the chat as we go if you don't want to hang on to those questions and forget them by the time we get to the Q&A. I'll just wait to answer them until the end of the webinar. Just know that I'm not ignoring you. It's just really hard for me to see the questions coming in and also present. So we will have about 30 minutes at the end for Q&A. Feel free to put questions in the chat as we go. We'll just wait to answer those until the end. But we're really excited that you're joining us this evening. I'm sure most of you are familiar with HEAL. You either get our emails or follow us on social media is how you heard about the webinar tonight. But for those who might not be as familiar, we are the Healthy Environment Alliance of Utah, and we're a grassroots policy organization. We've been around for a little over 25 years, and we work on issues related to clean air, clean energy, and toxic and radioactive waste here in Utah. So to just go through our campaigns very briefly, as I mentioned, one of our campaigns is focused on clean energy. So we support renewable energy and are trying to help the state get more energy online through solar, wind, geothermal, etc. We also work on issues related to toxic and radioactive waste. Utah has a rich history with toxic and radioactive waste. We worked on issues related to the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. So getting folks who lived downwind of the Nevada test site compensation for the cancers that they're facing now due to their exposure to the fallout from nuclear weapons testing. That's just one example of what we've done with our toxic and radioactive waste campaign, but you can read a lot more about that campaign on our website. But I want to make sure that we can spend a lot of time tonight on the issue that brought you all here, and that is our air quality campaign. So of course, we work on issues related to air quality, and we'll get into all the different campaigns that we've been working on. But before we do that, I want to just kind of set the stage and give you some background about what air quality issues we face here in Utah. And I want to start by telling you a little bit about our 4 air quality seasons. Now, I will say these 4 air quality seasons don't fall neatly into like a winter, spring, summer, fall type of season, but a lot of these air quality seasons do follow seasonal patterns, and we'll get into each of these a little bit more. But just to give you a preview, we have our inversion season here in Utah, which typically is during the wintertime months. Our peak inversion season is from December through February. And that's that layer of smog that you often see settling over the valley throughout the winter months. That is what an inversion is. But we also have our dust season, which is typically during drier months when we don't have precipitation to hold the dust down on the ground. And we have big wind events that will kick up the dust into the air and introduce a number of health concerns, but also air quality issues. We also have our ozone season, which is typically during the summer months, but as we'll talk about, Utah has a very unique wintertime ozone issue in particular parts of the state. And then we also have our wildfire season. I don't think I need to explain to anyone why wildfires impact our air quality, but of course, those introduce pollutants into the air and cause a number of different concerns as well. But let's dive into each of those a little bit more. And I'll try not to get too sciencey, so just bear with me. But I do just want to give you a little bit of an explanation of what an inversion is and why do we experience so many inversions here in the Salt Lake Valley. So inversions, we're primarily concerned with PM 2.5 during an inversion. PM 2.5 stands for particulate matter. 2.5 is the size of the molecule. So we're talking about really, really tiny molecules that can penetrate our lungs, our bloodstream, and we'll talk about some of the health impacts from that. But PM 2.5 is the primary pollutant during an inversion. And inversions are actually really fascinating to learn about as far as the science behind inversions. So inversions, as I mentioned, primarily happen during the winter. December through February is really peak inversion season. And the reason an inversion happens is because normally there's warm air close to the ground and the colder air is higher up in the atmosphere. But an inversion happens when those two pockets of air invert. So you have colder air that's closer to the ground, and then you have warmer air up top that's trapping that cooler air. And the reason we have inversions during the winter is because as we get snow and that settles on the ground, it creates these pockets of cooler air in the valley, which then allows the warmer air to settle up top. So that's the end. I won't get into more of the science. That's a super simplified version of why an inversion happens. But oftentimes it takes a big weather event to push an inversion out of the valley, which is why we sometimes have days, even weeks at a time when we're dealing with inversions. So that's a little bit about an inversion. Particulate matter, as I mentioned, is a pollutant we're really concerned about because it is really small and it can penetrate our lungs, penetrate our bloodstream, and bypass our body's natural defense. And that can cause a number of different issues, respiratory issues, cardiovascular issues. We'll also talk about another type of PM, and that's PM10. So those molecules are going to be a little bit bigger and not able to penetrate as much in the body, but they're still really concerning. Particulate matter in general is a very concerning pollutant for us. But enough on inversions. Let's talk a little bit about dust. And this one is really easy to visualize. I'm sure that you've seen a dust storm at some point in your life, whether it's dust blowing off of Great Salt Lake, like it's pictured here, or even dust blowing off of one of the many mines that we have throughout the Salt Lake Valley. Those gravel pits often can produce fugitive dust, and that dust, unsurprisingly, is harmful to breathe in. Dust can really occur year-round, but we often see it a lot in the drier months when we have big wind events because, again, the ground is a little bit drier. There's not as much precipitation holding that dust down to the ground. And primarily this is caused by, like I mentioned, big wind events. So whether that's wind on Great Salt Lake or wind over a gravel pit, that causes dust to kick up into the air. And with dust, the primary pollutant we're concerned about is PM10. So we just talked about PM 2.5, a little bit smaller. PM10 is going to be a little bit larger. Still a number of different health impacts from PM10, but we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few slides. The third air quality season, as we briefly talked about, is ozone. And I mentioned that ozone is primarily an issue in the summertime months. That's true here in the Salt Lake Valley. We are a non-attainment area for ozone, and that's primarily because of summertime ozone. So ozone is actually a secondary pollutant. So ozone is created when VOCs, which are volatile organic compounds, and NOx, which is nitrogen oxide, when those two emissions react in the presence of sunlight. That's why it's such a big problem in the summertime months because we get a lot of sunlight and pretty intense sunlight at that. So we often experience ozone in the summertime. Now, I mentioned there are parts of the state that have a unique wintertime ozone problem. That's true in the Uinta Basin, so the vernal area. And that's because the Uinta Basin is an oil and gas basin. A good deal of oil and gas production in the Uinta Basin, and oil and gas operations often emit VOCs and NOx. And why that's a problem in the wintertime months is because that concentration of VOCs and NOx is so high, and the sunlight reflects off the snow, and so then can catalyze and accelerate that reaction between the VOCs and the NOx to create ozone. So it's a unique problem. There are only really two places in the country that have wintertime ozone. It's us here in the Uinta Basin, and then there's another oil and gas producing basin up in Wyoming that experiences a very similar issue. But it's a unique challenge, and we'll talk a little bit more about what we've done to address wintertime ozone here. But then our fourth and final air quality season is wildfire season. With wildfires, we're primarily concerned about PM 2.5. So again, those really small particles. But it's important to mention that wildfires can also lead to problems with ozone. And that's because as fire smoke travels, the chemicals that are emitted from the burning fire often include VOCs and NOx, and that causes that chemical reaction to create ozone. So we often see some widespread ozone issues with wildfire season here in Utah and across the West. So I want to talk a little bit about how we measure air quality, and we'll talk a little bit about the health impacts of that as well. But I want to start with the air quality index. Chances are you've probably heard about the air quality index, or the AQI, and that's what we use to measure our air quality and its associated impacts. So if you look to the chart on the right-hand side, you can see various air quality ranges there. You can then see how we score that range. And then, of course, you can see the color association with that range as well. With the air quality index, we measure 5 major pollutants. We measure ground level ozone, particle pollution, which includes both PM 2.5 and PM 10. We measure carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, and then nitrogen dioxide as well. You might have heard of, a red air day before. That most likely means that air quality is in that unhealthy range, so 151 to 200. And those are often days that we tell everyone to stay inside, try to limit outdoor activity, just so that you're limiting your exposure to poor air quality. Now, a point that I want to make, because you see the 0 to 50 range says good and it's green, and that probably feels really reassuring. And I don't want to be the bearer of bad news, but there really is no healthy level of air pollution. Even on those green days, you are exposing yourself to a level of air pollution that cumulatively can cause a number of different issues in the body. So when we talk about the health impacts of air pollution, I like to think about it as this timeline, because you have the short-term exposure and some of the immediate impacts you feel, but you also have that long-term, that more cumulative exposure. So in the short term, you might experience things like coughing, shortness of breath, wheezing. We even see a spike in hospitalizations for respiratory events and even cardiac episodes here in Utah whenever we have poor air quality. As you move farther along that timeline, you see exacerbating respiratory infections and illnesses like asthma, eventually leading to the development of pulmonary and reactive airway disease, high blood pressure. And then at the end of that timeline, we start to see air pollution related health events, pretty severe health events like strokes, heart attacks, even premature deaths. And there are a number of fascinating studies going on that even look at the mental health impacts of air quality and how it increases instances of things like depression and anxiety. So there's a lot of really neat research happening, but unfortunately, the results of that research have been pretty concerning. And I just want to share this excerpt. It's from a study that was done by a number of different researchers from the University of Utah, from BYU, from Yale, from USU, and they came together and tried to quantify what that health impact is to the average Utahn. And they found that air pollution in Utah causes anywhere from about 2,500 to 8,000 premature deaths every year, and that it decreases the median life expectancy of someone who lives in Utah by 1.1 to 3.5 years. And that's a pretty considerable impact. And as we think about Great Salt Lake continuing to experience a number of challenges, more lake bed being exposed, more dust being kicked up into the air, you can't help but be concerned about how that impact changes over time and how it potentially worsens for Utahns. So let's kind of move into talking about how we regulate air quality. Because obviously we know air quality is an issue. We want to make sure we're measuring it, but then what do we actually do when we find out we have bad air quality? Well, the super simplified version is that the EPA designates these non-attainment areas. So federally, we have standards known as the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. We sometimes call that NAAQS for short. And those standards are adjusted over the years based on new research, but it essentially sets a limit for how much pollution in each of these categories we can allow. As I mentioned, there's no safe level of pollution, but we can't expect to live in a totally pollution-free world because we have industry. That industry is important to the way we live. There has to be a balance there. So these national air quality standards are set by the EPA. They're set under these 6 categories. So they set a standard for carbon monoxide, for lead, for nitrogen dioxide, ozone, particle pollution, and sulfur dioxide. Now, if an area is found to be exceeding those allowable levels of a certain pollutant, then the EPA designates a non-attainment area, which just means you're not attaining the air quality standards for that area. Now, the levels of non-attainment can vary. So it can be anything from marginal non-attainment, so you're barely outside of that threshold, to extreme non-attainment. You're very much outside of that threshold. And each of those varying levels of attainment come with different requirements. But overall, non-attainment creates additional responsibilities for a state. It involves the state going through a state implementation plan, which essentially is a plan for how the state plans to come back into attainment. It also introduces additional permitting requirements for industry. It's harder to get a permit in a non-attainment area as opposed to an attainment area. So there are a number of different protections that are triggered whenever an area enters non-attainment. And that's to protect the health of people, understanding that pollution is already exceeding the allowable level. We want to do everything possible to make sure that we can get ourselves back into attainment and try to limit the harm to people. So you might be asking, well, is Utah in non-attainment? And the short answer is yes. We're really concerned with 2 primary pollutants here in Utah. So particulate matter, so that particle pollution, and also ozone. I included a couple of maps here that show you the non-attainment areas. So on the left, you can see the non-attainment area for PM 2.5. Perhaps unsurprisingly, that is concentrated along the Wasatch Front. And you can see all the way up through Ogden, all the way down through Provo. And then on the right, you can see where we're in non-attainment for ozone. This is where you'll see, as I mentioned, the Wasatch Front is in non-attainment for ozone, particularly summertime months is where we see the spike. But then the Uinta Basin over there on the right is also in non-attainment for ozone, but that's that kind of unique wintertime ozone problem. So those are the 2 main non-attainment areas in the state to highlight for you. I also just want to take a minute to review our air monitoring network in the state. So this is a network of air quality monitors that is managed by our state's Division of Air Quality. And as you can see on the right, you can see the entire state of Utah. And then on the left, it kind of goes into that Wasatch Front area in a little bit more detail. But we have about 25 monitoring sites throughout the state of Utah. And those are like official monitoring sites that DAQ is managing and what the data we're officially using for DAQ's regulatory purposes. There, of course, are additional monitors outside of this, but they're not the same regulatory grade monitor that creates data that the state can actually use to measure air quality and to create these air quality plans. So these are the really important monitors because they're the official monitors, often the most accurate monitors, allow us to monitor the most pollutants because sometimes only certain monitors can monitor certain pollutants. And so it gets really complicated and really expensive sometimes to monitor air quality. But even then, I mean, my takeaway from seeing this map is that there are quite a few maybe obvious gaps throughout the state. I'm glad to see that we've got a concentration along the Wasatch Front, given that's where most of the population is. But I think there can definitely be more and expanded monitoring along the Wasatch Front, especially if you see on the west side of I-15 there, it's looking pretty sparse. And then as you look to more southern parts of the state, you can see some pretty obvious gaps. Seeing Price all the way down to Hurricane, it's quite the gap there. So there's a lot of work to be done to improve our air monitoring network, but I just wanted to give you a baseline sense of what we're looking at and what the state is looking at as far as air quality data. So now I want to dive a little bit into where our pollution comes from. So, what are the sources of pollution in Utah that we're most concerned about? Um, Unsurprisingly, maybe there are lots of sources of pollution in the state. We categorize them in different ways: mobile source emissions, area source emissions, point source emissions. I'll spare you all of the technical details there, but I do want to talk about some of the big ones. I want to talk about mobile source emissions a little bit, particularly on-road emissions. As I'll talk about in a minute, we categorize mobile source emissions into on-road emissions, so things like vehicles, and then off-road emissions, so things like construction equipment or lawn equipment. But our mobile source emissions are a leading source of emissions here along the Wasatch Front. We talked about inversions earlier, and we talked about the primary pollutant in inversions being PM 2.5. While transportation emissions account for nearly half of our PM 2.5 emissions during a typical inversion event. So inversions are most certainly made worse by an increase in vehicle emissions. And that has, historically speaking, been one of the leading sources of emissions here on the Wasatch Front. I have seen some data lately that shows that we are improving our mobile source emissions because of more fuel efficient cars, more electric vehicles, more efficient regulations, tier 3 fuels, which are cleaner fuels. But it is still a leading source of emissions and one that we need to continue to tackle. The next source of emissions I want to talk about is Great Salt Lake. As I mentioned earlier, Great Salt Lake is a pretty considerable source of dust for folks living in the Salt Lake Valley. And I want to share this quote from DAQ's annual report. 50% of the Great Salt Lake lakebed, or playa, has been exposed over the last 40 years. And with that comes the potential for wind-blown dust where 80% of Utahns live. So we're talking about nearly half of Great Salt Lake now being exposed, and that putting upwards of 80% of Utahns at risk of breathing in that dust. I really want to hit home the point that we are still learning about the dust composition of Great Salt Lake. There have been some great studies that have been done that have kind of laid the groundwork for understanding what exactly is in the dust, but there are still a lot of unanswered questions. And until we fully understand what is in the dust that we're breathing from Great Salt Lake, we cannot begin to understand what those health impacts are beyond the fact that they're bad. So that's a really important area of research that we hope to see continue and hope to see the state really recommit itself to helping save Great Salt Lake and getting more water in the lake, because that's really the best solution to limiting the amount of dust that we see in the air from Great Salt Lake. And then the third and final source of emission that I just want to highlight here for us today is what's called two-stroke lawn equipment. So two-stroke lawn equipment is lawn equipment that is often powered by an oil and gas mixture. It includes things like your leaf blowers, your string trimmers, your hedge trimmers. Oftentimes, it does not include things like your lawnmower. That's typically four-stroke lawn equipment, slightly different category. But the reason I want to bring up two-stroke lawn equipment, and I love the opportunity to share this quote every time I can, using a gas-powered leaf blower for 1 hour emits the same as driving the average vehicle 727 miles. Yes, you heard me correct. Using a gas-powered leaf blower for 1 hour is the same as driving the average vehicle over 700 miles. That is a crazy number. And I had to triple check that to make sure that I wasn't reading it incorrectly. I've talked with folks at DEQ to make sure I'm understanding it correctly. And that statistic is correct. And that's really troubling. But at the same time, it's exciting that that feels like pretty low-hanging fruit we can go after. Replacing gas-powered lawn equipment with electric lawn equipment is something that should be a relatively easy thing to do. There have been some efforts at the legislature to try to transition state government facilities away from gas-powered lawn equipment and adopting electric lawn equipment, just to kind of demonstrate to people that this is a change that the state is willing to make. It's a change that homeowners and others should also follow. Unfortunately, that bill hasn't passed. We can kind of get into the details of that. But like Salt Lake City, for example, has had a really cool lawn exchange program the past few years where you could trade in your gas-powered lawn equipment and get a portion of money to go towards new electric lawn equipment. So that's really exciting, low-hanging fruit that I think we can go after that would reduce our emissions. And if you're watching this and trying to figure out ways that you might be able to personally reduce your emissions, and you own gas-powered lawn equipment, this could be a really good next step for you. So now I want to talk about this. I would be remiss if I didn't mention West Side air quality challenges and how the west side of Salt Lake City experiences particularly severe air quality challenges and has some of the worst air quality here in the valley. And that's for a number of different reasons. So historically, there has been an east-west divide in Salt Lake City, and that's for a number of reasons. Union Pacific Railroad runs right through the city. That north-south corridor creates a physical split between the east and west side of the city. Um, the west side of the city was a target of redlining in the 1930s and the 1940s, so discriminatory zoning practices. And then fast forward a little bit to the 1970s and the construction of I-15, which once again created a pretty physical barrier between the west side and the east side. So we've got this divide on our hands. We also see a greater concentration of industrial facilities on the west side. We see more highways on the west side. We see west side is really at the doorstep of Great Salt Lake and the West Desert and mining in the Ochre Mountains, like the Kennecott mine. So it's not all that surprising that West Side communities have some of the worst air quality. We've also seen that roads have really been built to accommodate industrial automobile traffic on the west side. And we'll talk about why this is relevant in a minute. But I just want to share a statistic that only about 36% of Salt Lake City's residents live on the west side, but yet they account for about 77% of traffic-related fatalities. And that's from a Building Salt Lake article in 2023. And they did an analysis of traffic-related incidents. And that's a really disheartening statistic. And the reason that that is so important, beyond the fact that those are lives lost that we could prevent through better infrastructure, is it really hits home the fact that on the west side, but also throughout the city, we have built this car-centric infrastructure that doesn't really allow people the safe option of, walking, biking, even sometimes taking public transit. And so that really further reinforces our dependence on vehicles, which then increases our emission, which then worsens our air quality, which then leads to more health impacts. And the EPA has even confirmed that Salt Lake City's west side deals with worse air quality, higher health risks from that, such as cancer and asthma, lower life expectancy, and also lower quality of life. So this is a very real challenge that we've done a number of studies and we've been able to actually measure. And so now I know that half of the webinar was kind of doom and gloom, but I want to change gears a little bit and get us into more of the optimistic stuff. So what is the solution here? And particularly, what is the role of transportation in helping us find a solution to our air quality problems? As you might have seen when signing up for this webinar, we are celebrating Week Without Driving this week. Week Without Driving is an opportunity to get people out of their cars, to commit to either a full week or even just a day of trying to go car-free because a great chunk of our population doesn't have access to a vehicle, doesn't have a driver's license. And so this is an opportunity to kind of step into their shoes and see what it's like to leave your car behind. We've also got some fun opportunity drawings happening this week. So just a quick plug to check out our event page and sign up for Week Without Driving if you haven't already, and follow us along on social media throughout the week. But to get into this transportation piece, we first need to really understand what the challenges are. Right now, there's pretty limited public transit access, particularly on West Side communities, and it's largely because of that East-West divide. But there's also limited transit options in city suburbs. There's a lot of urban sprawl here in Salt Lake City. I'm down in Sandy, for example, and if I were to take public transit to get to our office in downtown Salt Lake, it would take me almost 2 hours, and I'd have to get on at least two different buses. And that's compared to a 20-minute drive in my own vehicle. So for many people, it's just not even an option. It's a non-starter to use public transit. Maybe you have a family and getting kids on public transit and being subject to the schedule of the bus just doesn't feel practical. That's a really big problem right now. We also, as I mentioned before, have infrastructure that prioritizes vehicles over pedestrians. And I want to use a recent example of UDOT's push to expand I-15 and to add additional lanes on pretty big highway. We worked with a coalition of organizations in West Side communities to largely oppose that expansion because we felt that the state really hadn't done enough to invest in public transit and other options before just resorting to expanding the highway, which in our view kind of induces demand, creates more demand for driving, but also creates more air quality problems for us when we already are dealing with enough. So that's an example of a project that we often see that prioritizes vehicles over pedestrians, over transit. Of course, there's the elephant in the room, as there always is. Funding is limited, transit projects can be expensive, and so we often have funding challenges there. But if there's anything you take away from this slide, I hope it's that alternative forms of transportation, like public transit or like active transit, which includes things like walking or biking, really aren't realistic options for people. And that's the biggest challenge of them all. The question is, how can we make those options make more sense for people so that they're more inclined to do that instead of driving? And that kind of leads us into a couple of our recent campaigns. So I talked a little bit about I-15 expansion. We launched this campaign. It was blank over freeways, and you could fill in that space with whatever was important to you. Whether it's communities over freeways, people over freeways, air quality over freeways, public transit over freeways. That was really just an opportunity to get people to talk about things they would rather see funded over a multi-billion-dollar freeway expansion. We also recently have had an action alert to try to get Congress to support the Stronger Communities Through Better Transit Act. You can go on our website, you can learn more about this. This action alert is still open, so I would encourage you to fill it out, contact your members of Congress, ask them to support this bill. But what it essentially does is kind of rewrites the funding, federal funding for transit. Right now, transit is really only funded federally for the infrastructure. So you can use federal dollars to build the rail, to acquire the buses, but you can't use that funding for operational costs, which is 2/3 of the cost of transit, which includes things like paying your drivers, paying for fuel. And so we're trying to encourage Congress to expand what federal transit funding can be used for so that we can better support communities in being able to afford transit, particularly rural communities who have a lot of funding challenges with transit. We've also done some work in the active transit space. So we've started our mobility audits in the past year. And what these mobility audits are is they're these citizen-led data collection projects where we have people go out into their communities to walk a certain route, to bike a certain route, and help us collect data on how that experience was. You know, were there dedicated bike lanes? Were there pedestrian crossings? Was there even a sidewalk for you to use? They then record that data, submit that data to us. We share that data with city planners to help them identify some of the places that are in need of improvements and also help them think about some of these factors when planning future projects. So that's been a really cool initiative that we're hoping to expand in the next year. And you can find more information on our website if you're interested in doing your own mobility audit in your neighborhood or on your commute to work. It can be a really easy thing to just integrate into your everyday routine while also helping us collect really important data to share with our elected officials and decision makers. We also, in the past, have had a really cool Free Fare for Clean Air campaign where we worked with all of the partners you see here. So the Division of Environmental Quality, the Department of Environmental Quality, excuse me, UTA, the Utah State Legislature, and we were able to get funding to actually create certain days throughout the year where you could use transit for free. And those were on our bad air quality days to try to encourage people to get out of their cars, to use transit. And we took away that barrier of having to pay for transit to hopefully get more people to take advantage of transit. And we're still doing some analysis on the data there, but some of the preliminary results have shown that that free fare program increased ridership substantially, especially on Front Runner, especially on the weekends. And so we're trying to explore ways that in the future we can maybe look at more free fare options so that people can take advantage of transit and it can maybe just make it that much easier for them to use transit. We've also in the past done a really cool campaign around installing mobile air quality monitors on the back of electric buses to help us collect hyper-local air quality data. We particularly focused on West Side communities for that project, and that helped us collect neighborhood level air quality data. As you saw earlier, our air quality monitoring network could definitely use improvement. And so that helped us kind of fill some of those gaps and get a little bit better data at the local level. I will also mention that it's been difficult to expand public transit in West Side communities because of that east-west divide, particularly the rail crossings. If you've ever gone from the west side to the east side or east side to the west side, there's a good chance you were stopped by a train at some point. And sometimes you can be sitting at that crossing for 30, 40, 50 minutes. And that makes it really difficult to run a bus route when there's that level of unpredictability. So that's just maybe another thing to point out about why it's been a challenge to get more transit on the west side, and why it's important for us to focus on that divide. And then we've also worked on projects in rural Utah, trying to expand access to public transit in rural Utah, helping host town halls, make the case to elected officials that people care about transit. It's not just a Salt Lake City issue, it's an issue throughout the state. You know, Park City's got a lot of really cool transit programs. I won't nerd out about their transit too much, even though it's great. But they've got a cool like transit to trails program where you can actually use transit to get to a trailhead and not have to worry about the parking situation at the trailhead. And that's a really cool example of how rural Utah might be able to take advantage of transit in the future as well. So as we look forward and as we begin to wrap up here, a couple of projects that we're working on and we could use your help with. The first is that walk audit, mobility audit piece. As I mentioned, it is a citizen-led data collection effort, and we need lots of people to help us collect that data. We plan on hosting future events where we do group mobility audits, and you could come out, join us, do that mobility audit, collect data with a group of people. But we also want to empower you to do that on your own, whether it's by yourself or hosting a group of friends and collecting data. You could turn it into a fun evening. But we really need more data and we need your help to get more data so that we can make the case to our city officials, but also to entities like the Wasatch Front Regional Council, which do area planning for the Salt Lake Valley as a whole, that people care about active transit, They care about better pedestrian infrastructure, and they want to see improvements, and they want to see that prioritized. As I mentioned before, we're also looking at reintroducing the Zero Fares for Clean Air program. So trying to once again introduce that pilot program. As I mentioned before, it was only a pilot program, only funded a number of days, and that money has since been exhausted. So we're looking at seeing if we could do maybe a 6-month to a year-long pilot program to really be able to measure the impact of what Zero Fares does for our ridership and for our air quality here in the Valley, but also down in Utah County. As I mentioned plenty of times, we have a west-east divide, in case you didn't already pick up on that. So one of the things that HEAL's really excited about is we've been given the opportunity to help Salt Lake City in their ongoing study looking at that east-west divide. So Salt Lake City got some federal funding to look at ways that they could improve that divide and get rid of some of those barriers. So we're working with Salt Lake City right now and some different focus groups to see what solutions we can find and how we can get rid of that divide and how we can get more transit in West Side communities. And then the fourth point, we are looking and trying to secure additional funding for improved air quality monitoring. As I showed you on that map earlier, there are certainly gaps in our air quality monitoring network, and I'm sure that our state agencies would also agree with that. And air quality monitors are expensive. They're not cheap. It's not an easy fix. So we're working with the legislature, with state agencies, and trying to find ways to fund more air quality monitors throughout the state, but especially in communities that we know really need that better monitoring. Because if we don't have monitoring, we don't have a baseline, and we don't have a way to better regulate our air quality emissions. So as I mentioned, we need your help with all of those things. But I want to give you 3 tangible actions that you could take after leaving us this evening. First and foremost, if you haven't already, sign up for our email updates. If you go to our website, the bottom of the page, there's an opportunity to sign up for our emails. Those are especially important if you want to be notified about upcoming events, upcoming opportunities. We'll send you our monthly newsletter during the legislative session, which I can't believe I haven't even mentioned yet, which runs from January through March. We are up on Capitol Hill, tracking bills, talking with legislators, and we'll send you updates on how that's going and how we could use your help during the legislative session. So sign up for our email updates. As I mentioned before as well, we also have some open action alerts right now on our website. You can visit healutah.org/action alert /. That'll take you to all of our open action alerts. We've got some action alerts about transit. We've got some action alerts about the uranium mill and White Mesa, about all of our campaigns. So you're welcome to check out our open action alerts. We give you a description and what you need to know, and then a way to contact your lawmakers, whether it's Congress or your state legislators. So check out our ongoing action alerts. And then finally, another legislative session plug. I would urge you to sign up to lobby with HEAL during the legislative session. After I'm done sharing my screen here, I'll share a link in the chat, or maybe Carmen or someone can share that link to our Take Action page, which gives you a spot to sign up for emails, to check out our action alerts, and to also sign up to lobby with us during the legislative session. We've got a pretty robust community lobbying program, and every week up on Capitol Hill, you'll come up and join us. You don't have to join us every week, but you can pick a week, join us up at the Capitol. We'll walk you through the legislative process, so how a bill becomes a law. We'll tell you about some of the bills that we're following at that point in time. And then at the end, we will set up a meeting between you and your legislator, where you'll actually get to talk to your legislator about the issues that matter to you. We'll be there with you for that meeting if it's your first time and you're kind of nervous talking with your legislator, but it's a great opportunity to get some face time with your legislators. And I think now more than ever, it's really important that they hear from you, and that you're up there advocating for the problems that matter most to you. So join us for the legislative session. It's always a good time up at the Capitol. That is the end of what I have prepared for you. Thanks for listening to me talk for about 45 minutes. I now want to open it up if folks have any questions. As you can see on the screen, there's my email, there's a link to the website. You're also welcome to reach out to me at any time if you have questions about any of this, you want to set up a mobility audit but don't know where to start, or maybe you want to host an event or have an idea for an event, reach out to me. We can chat more. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop recording here, and then we'll get into the Q&A.